In 1700, at the height of the Mughal Empire under Emperor Aurangzeb, the Timuri dynasty, as they called themselves, ruled nearly the entire Indian subcontinent. It was the largest, most powerful Muslim empire in the world. It was also the wealthiest empire in the world. A quarter of the global commercial activity flowed through the Asian subcontinent. And the Mughal emperor's sovereignty became a dominant fixture of Indian political and cultural life. Yet within 3 generations, Mughal power and prestige would be eclipsed by a commercial trading company from England. The empire lost its central imperial will and indeed its ability to enforce rule. Of course, this raises the question, how did this come about? Did the Mughals decline? Were they conquered? Taken over? Well, as you've probably guessed, the answer is rather more complex. In this lecture, we're going to examine how one of the most vibrant commercial centers in the global economy drifted towards colonialism, and how this set the stage for an eventual conquest of India, either by a regional Indian or indeed a foreign power. First, we're going to look more closely at the regionalization of the Mughal Empire in the 1700s. Second, we'll proceed to look at how India fit within the broader global economy in that period. Third, we'll analyze the great merchant and banking families of North India, who, as we'll see, not only supported regional Indian kingdoms, but who would also later play a critical role in the emergence of British rule. In all, we'll see how the regionalization of the Mughal Empire, coupled with broader global economic trends, combined with the interests of India's great commercial families, all converged to provide what we would call a recipe for colonialism. And it helps us understand how the British later took advantage of these dynamics to conquer India within 2 generations. Now, let's first start with an overview of the Mughal Empire and its 18th century regionalization. Now, on the surface, the Mughal Empire may have looked the world's grandest, but beneath the surface, there were significant changes taking place in regional politics that would quickly unravel the Mughal Empire's ability to govern. In 1707, the last great Mughal emperor, Aurangzeb, died. Yet his successors were weak and far less effective in governing. They also were seemingly blind to changing political realities in India. And as we've discussed in the previous lecture, the running of debts in Mughal India was crucial for enabling zamindars, subhadars, and maharajas to consolidate their own regional kingdoms, mainly in places such as Awadh, Bengal, and Mysore. Mughal wealth and expansion had come at a real cost. The expansion and military campaigns of Aurangzeb had fiscally taxed the Mughal administrative system. And we also saw how regional kingdoms emerged which continued the spirit of the Mughal emperor, even if they were covertly subverting his authority in Delhi. Now, let's go a bit deeper into this regionalization. What do regional kingdoms do with each other everywhere? Well, let's think medieval Europe. They fight and compete, usually over disputed borders and access to resources. So think about it. What skills and occupations would be valuable to these kingdoms? You got it. Religious officiators, scribes, and soldiers. The emergence of competing regional kingdoms in 18th century India had a real dynamic effect. It opened up new sources of opportunity for revenue-hungry states and numerous social, military, and economic actors. Now, let's talk about religious officiators. In many regional states which sought to penetrate deeper into the countryside and tax, and in the countryside, this is where most Hindus and Brahmins lived. Both Hindu and Muslim rulers needed to seek out the favor of Brahmins. For these rulers, Brahmins were often the source of power and legitimacy in the countryside. This was because they provided, if they were Hindu rulers, ritual affirmation of a Hindu king. But even if the rulers were Muslim, Brahmins carried sway in society and deep into villages, giving Muslim rulers some theoretical legitimacy. Thus, regional states that wanted their cultivators to pay taxes often had to have Brahmins give it their okay. Now, another group which became sought after in 18th century India were pensmen and scribes. Pensmen and scribes were both Hindu and Muslim. They generally came from less elite and landed backgrounds, but they were usually literate in Persian, accountancy, and paper management. The largest group of Hindu scribes, Kayasthas, also became known as an almost Islamized group who documented taxes, military finance, and wrote imperial edicts. They were so marked because after Brahmins, Kayasthas were the most literate caste in all of India. And since many Brahmins refused to enter service under Muslim rulers, this gave Kayasthas an open playing field. Muslim scribes, of which there were far fewer, were also paper managers. They had the advantage of being Muslim, for they faced fewer barriers to patronage and employment. They often came from middle-class backgrounds, were literate, and held lands, but were neither politically nor militarily elite. Now you might ask yourself, why would scribes be so sought after? I mean, they managed paper. Think taxes. Scribes were needed to manage the increasingly paper-driven fiscal regimes of these regional kingdoms. Hindu and Muslim scribes became highly sought after and employable after the 1720s. They commanded skills in Persian, the language of court and administration, which made them crucial for regional kingdoms that wanted to further tax and assess. In North India, for example, between Delhi and Calcutta, Kayasthas emerged as the single greatest beneficiary of the late Mughal and 18th century drive towards fiscalism. Now, if the pen was crucial for these regional kingdoms, the sword was equally important. After all, regional kingdoms seeking to expand, conquer, and enforce rule all need steel, gunpowder, and muscle. Everyone from common soldiers or sepoys to advisors and strategists saw a boom in employment across India. Regional states such as Mysore, the Maratha Confederacy, and Awadh built large armies. Awadh probably had over 50,000 standing troops. The Maratha Confederacy maintained an 80,000-plus standing force. Mysore in the south also maintained tens of thousands of troops. Larger armies were a regular sight in 1700s India. In fact, some historians have estimated that around 2% of India's entire population were in full-time uniform in the 1700s. And for you reservists and veterans out there, are all soldiers full-time? No. There were also a substantial number of part-time soldiers. Given the vagaries of the monsoons, cultivators and farmers, when faced with bad harvests, would often join armies part-time to supplement their incomes. In fact, coupled with full-time soldiery, it would be fair to say that probably close to 5% of India's population was engaged in direct warfare at some point during any given year. This is a far cry from the utopian, peaceful India that Gandhi convinced many of us had always existed. And the rise of soldiery in India also had substantial economic spillover effects. After all, what do soldiers often like to do with their money and when they have free time? Well, like most people, they spend it. This was sort of an Indian military-economic complex. Not only did soldiers need food and uniforms and military hardware, but also entertainment. Think booze and sex. Soldiers traditionally received a bata, or a military allowance, which was their disposable income. Bazaars were a cauldron of military hardware. All across India, you could find swords, matchlocks, gunpowder. There were cannon foundries across North India. Needless to say, Indian blacksmith castes who made these specialized tools of killing themselves made a killing. Yet the emergence of regional warfare also had effects upon the environment of India. These kingdoms paid for armies with taxes, and taxes came from agriculture. But of course, not in India, like all places, not all of land is farmland. Large uncultivated lands were inhabited by forest dwellers and wandering itinerant holy men in India for thousands of years. The Buddha himself was one perfect example. Starting in the 1700s, these regional kingdoms started clearing forests. They did this for a few reasons. First, to increase the amount of taxable, arable land. This meant more revenue for the army, courts, scribes, and general administration. For some kingdoms, it could be the difference between victory and defeat. But deforestation offered a tactical advantage as well. Fewer trees denied cover to the enemy. Yet it also ensured that more Indians would work the land as peasants and farmers. And as we'll see, that the shift towards greater agricultural labor, which we see in the 18th century, was not created by the British, but later accelerated it more intensely after colonial rule. Now, one event which accelerated this military fiscalism deserves particular mention. In 1739, the Afghan warrior Nadir Shah invaded and looted Delhi. Having defeated the armies of the Mughal Emperor Muhammad Shah, Nadir Shah reigned in Delhi. His name was read from the main mosque in Old Delhi, the Jama Masjid, which is the ultimate proof of who ruled the Mughal Empire. Of course, though, there was a darker side to this. Nadir Shah's soldiers went on a massacre. Up to 20,000 people in Delhi were killed as a revenge attack against an attack on his troops by local Hindus. The city became, in the words of one Persian observer, reduced to ashes. The Mughal Emperor Muhammad Shah was humiliated by being forced to beg on his knees for mercy. Nadir Shah looted so much that historians have estimated he made off with 15 million pounds sterling in 18th century money. Now, this invasion sent shockwaves throughout India's regional kingdoms. They all now felt they had to bolster their armies and defenses. If the Grand Mughal Emperor could not protect India, then rulers in Bengal, Punjab, and the Maratha lands, in addition to Awadh, had to bolster their own armies themselves. So if we step back for a moment, what we see is that all these regional states practiced something we would call military fiscalism. These kingdoms were increasingly shifting their spending and prerogatives towards armies. And this affected how agriculture was expanded, taxed, and administered. It also greatly affected the rhythms of India's regional economies and centers of production. For example, kingdoms that wanted to raise more revenue extended agricultural cultivation into wastelands. They cleared forests, displacing forest dwellers in tribal Adivasi or tribal communities. They settled lands that required capital and credit, which brought Hindu merchants and moneylenders into the picture. Newly settled lands also required administrators and scribes, around which sprouted shops, canteens, so you can imagine the spillover economic stimulus effects. And as we'll see in the next lecture, it was the British, rather than any Indian kingdom, who would eventually master this military fiscalism by 1800. Okay, now that we've covered the broader trend of political regionalization, let's look at how India fit more broadly within the global economy. And this is crucial because it was economic motives that initially brought the British to India. We need to understand what India offered economically and why it mattered. Because it was the strong European demand for Indian goods at the end of the day that also set the stage for European involvement in India. Starting back in the 1500s, the Portuguese were the first Europeans to try to get their hands on India's wealth. They operated out of Goa, their colony on the west coast. Later in the 1600s, the English, the Dutch, and the French also got involved. Mainly they worked out of coastal settlements and fortifications. They all competed with each other and sought to intercept the flow of trade between Southeast Asia, India, and the Middle East, that for centuries had been dominated by Muslims. But Europeans all desired, like India's Muslim conquerors and rulers before, India's wealth. And the potential spoils were massive. By 1700, the Indian economy was a sophisticated machine. Roughly a quarter of the world's total commerce passed through the Indian subcontinent. The Indian economy was buoyant and hummed along with commercial vibrancy. India in the 1700s was a great, exciting place for business and opportunity. Its economy linked up villages with larger all-India networks of commercial exchange and mobility. Letters of credit could originate in Bengal and be cashed across the subcontinent in Western India. Merchant families, for example, had branches across India and even into Central Asia. And it was the vibrancy and buoyancy of India's economy which was so attractive to Europeans. For a European who visited in the 1700s, India was a great place for business. The most crucial items in the Indian economy at the global level were textiles made from cotton and jute. Indian textiles were the world's most sought after between Europe, Indonesia, and, well, everywhere. The Indian artisanal economy was designed primarily for export. Europeans increasingly demanded Indian-made cloths for shirts, trousers, tablecloths, napkins, and tapestries. In some parts of Southeast Asia, Indian textiles were even accepted as a form of currency. And the English used Indian textiles to pay for slaves off the west coast of Africa, hence the term we might somewhat be familiar with, guinea cloth. So this is what India could offer the global economy. So it begs the question, what could Europe offer? What fabric was most common in Europe? and you've got it, wool. But are woolly jumpers useful in the Middle East and Asia? Not really. In spite of this, European commercial interests increasingly came to punctuate the Indian economy after the early 1700s. Most of all, and most significantly, the English. Now, one entity represented English, and later after 1707, British commercial interests in India, the English East India Trading Company. The English East India Trading Company was founded in 1600 by Queen Elizabeth I, largely at the behest of leading London merchants and traders who wanted to effectively compete in the India trade and with the Spanish and the Portuguese. It was one of the world's first publicly traded joint stock companies. It was given a monopoly of trade between India, the East Indies, and England. So if you were an English, and after 1707 a British subject, and you wanted to trade legitimately in India, you had to go through the company. Now, initially, the company did not have any political aims. In fact, the company explicitly wanted to avoid politics and power struggles because engaging in them could eat away at their potential profit. And since the company had shareholders, returns and dividends were paramount. If the company dabbled in political intrigue, which endangered profits, shareholders might withdraw their investments and demand payment. So up until the 1750s, the British and the English East India Company largely avoided getting involved in Indian political affairs. So as we've seen, the Indian economy was vibrant, and the British came from far away, unlike Arabs, Persians, and the Chinese. But the British did have a particular advantage when it came to trading with India. One of these was silver. Silver was the standard backing for India's various rupee currencies. The massive volume of silver available to Europeans from South America effectively gave the British bullion as the standard for their currency. But it needed to be extracted, melted, and shipped all the way to India. Thus, one precondition for British power was made possible by European access to the New World and the large flows of silver that were entering into Europe. The other advantage had to do with navies and ships. Now, we all know about the Royal Navy's importance to British history. In 1600, remember, the British had just defeated the Spanish Armada and was still fresh in people's memories. This bigger, built-up navy also played out to Britain's advantage in the Indian subcontinent. The navy ensured that Britain could command the long-term maritime trade between India and the outside world. The British and Europeans sailed from Europe around the southern African tip, all the way to India, effectively bypassing the old established land routes of the Middle East and the Mediterranean. So Europeans and the British dominated the high sea routes to India. But Indian empires, including the Mughals, were largely land-based. They were less interested in naval forces. Besides, everyone came to India. Indian traders and adventurers did not need to go as far overseas in terms of profit as did Europeans. The other advantage had to do with how the company protected its trade in India. Since it was far overseas in sometimes unknown and hostile areas, the company had its own private mercenary force. It had its own private army. The company had to protect its physical safety and commercial interests against various Nawab's armies and the border invasions and incursions that came to define 18th century India. And since the company, like other European trading companies in Asia, had no political responsibilities, it didn't have to abide by formal treaties or the rules of warfare. It was rather like the Blackwater of its time. It used to defend company's most valuable trading fort in Calcutta, but also its other forts in Bombay and Madras. This company force also protected as much as it could individual company traders up in the Indian interior. But here is where the real advantage comes into play. It mostly recruited Indian soldiers into its private army. Why? Because they cost less. Given its access to silver, the company was effectively able to pay better than regional Indian kingdoms. It paid its soldiers more and more regularly. It had a better mercenary force. It was overwhelmingly composed of Indian soldiers, or sipahis, under European command. And this was a regular and better paid force. But the British also had numerous disadvantages in terms of India trade. For one, British trade and presence was limited to the coasts. By the 1750s, they had not yet penetrated India's internal economy and trade in wheat and rice, cloths, minerals, and other more exotic textiles. This was where the real money was. So they knew nothing of upcountry interior trade, where large agrarian wealth lay, and which had been the source of wealth for kings and sultans for thousands of years. Also, being far away and literally stinking after the journey, the British, and Europeans more generally, were never really taken seriously by Indians and the Mughals. Europeans were not feared by Indian rulers and traders. Indian rulers and traders often saw them as crude, violent barbarians who loved the bottle. The other disadvantage was in knowledge. By the 1750s, the British knew very little about Indian customs, rituals, and religions. In a way, they kind of operated in the dark. And it was only after the conquests in the late 1700s that knowledge of India's great traditions and its broader civilization opened up to scholars and eventually the wider world. India's broader economy, as we've said, was buoyant and vibrant. It attracted traders from all over the world, from Africa to the Middle East to Southeast Asia. The Europeans were merely the latest round of visitors seeking to make fortunes. But it is also fair to say that India's economy was, in the 1700s, up for grabs. Either a regional Indian or external power was likely to command it eventually. So we have, on the one hand, a vibrant Indian economy, and on the other hand, an increasing drive for foreign commercial interests in India and the commercial opportunities it afforded. If we put these together, what do we get? We get a recipe for colonialism. Now that we've covered the Indian economy and the political regionalization of the Mughal Empire, let's now turn to look at the great Indian commercial and banking families. For to understand the eventual emergence of colonial rule, we need to look at Indian capital and Indian commercial interests themselves. These are very much part of the equation. Let's start by observing that India was not a pure, innocent victim of colonial conquest. There were a wider collection of indigenous Indian capitalists, merchant bankers, and moneylenders who were crucial in securing British domination by 1800. These merchant and banking families had started to become very influential at regional courts and for regional Indian kingdoms in the 1700s. For what do all governments, even ours today, always need more of? Of course, money. In the 1700s, the regional kingdoms of the Maratha Confederacy, Bengal, Awadh, Mysore, all needed more money and revenue to build up their administrations. They needed bureaucrats, scribes, accountants, artillery stores, provisions, you name it. With regional kingdoms competing over contested territory, fiscal might was crucial, lest newly won territory and influence fall to regional rivals. In effect, access to credit could ensure one's armed forces were more efficient than one's neighbors. So as we can see, Indian political rule was as much about credit and fiscal might as it was about armies and courts. Now, historically, Hindus and Jains have served as India's main moneylenders. This is because, for Muslims, they have largely shied away from charging interest, which they largely considered usury, even if Muslims were known for their trading skills and in weaving and the facilitation of trade. But when it came to finance and banking, Hindus and Jains have no prohibitions, either doctrinal or customary, on charging interest. It would be fair to call Jains India's true pacifists. They believe that everything has a soul and that all forms of killing are unacceptable. This means that they cannot serve in the military or even harvest root vegetables. But for Jains, money lending and banking are both ritually and spiritually clean. Now, these banking families had crucial advantages in the Indian economy, particularly in India's interior, where all of India's fiscal and material wealth lay. By virtue of not being Muslim, these families had easier access to the interior of India's agrarian wealth, commerce, and pilgrimage cities such as Benares, Mathura, and Haridwar. They moved grains, goods, and crucially, long-distance credit bills called hundis, which were honored across most of India. They could originate in Calcutta and be used in the Punjab, kind of like a Western Union money order. Some of these families had become extremely wealthy and influential by the mid-1700s. The Jagat Seths of Bengal, for example, had larger holdings than the whole Bank of England by 1750. In Awadh, two banking families commanded probably half of the kingdom's annual revenue. And it's here where we see a major shift in India's economic history. Previously, the Mughals and other rulers granted late trading and lead lending privileges to these families. But starting in the 1700s, with the opening up of this political regionalization, these families started to lend to those in charge. It was kind of like a reversal of roles, so to speak. So what these families started to do was to bankroll regional kingdoms. Nawabs, kings, sultans, and princes were extended lines of credit to finance wars and to build up administrations and armies. Coupled with overall Indian economic growth and European silver, these banking families were projected into new positions of influence. They were now visible at the court, and, as one French observer noted in the 1700s, even if they don't say much, when they did speak, everyone, particularly the king, listened very carefully. There were other economic factors related to land and lending which started to dominate the Indian economy. Previously, under the Mughals, if someone could not pay their taxes due, then extensive negotiations followed to arrange payments over time or through other means or other members of the landed family. But landowners rarely had their actual lands seized. However, in the heightened regional and fiscal climate of 18th century India, this started to give way to an auctioneering system of tax collection and land ownership. This auctioneering system meant that if you owned land and couldn't pay the revenue for which you were responsible, your lands might be seized and put up to auction for the highest bidder. This started to break with established custom, which in the case of non-payment, the responsibility for this payment would shift to someone else in the family. But the fiscalism of these kingdoms started to basically throw the concept of private property out the window. And this is where the banking and money-lending families of India come into play. Being moneyed, they could now bid for these lands and the right to collect revenue. And this is really significant, for it put more money-minded castes, who were largely Vaishyas, into the ownership of larger estates, which then colored the ways Indian peasants were taxed and assessed and indeed treated. And this mattered because is this what the British encountered and eventually accelerated with savage intensity after the 1780s. This pressure on land was further exacerbated by European demand for Indian textiles. Since indigo, cotton, silk, and jute were required for exportable textiles, greater European demand led regional kingdoms to tax commerce less and the landed economy more. And when demand and profitability were greater, so were the severity and the intensity of tax collections. Now, even though these banking families were becoming more important and influential, they also tended to bump up against the prerogatives of courts. Regional kings in Awadh, Mysore, and Bengal, for example, required generous lines of credit to maintain armies and administrations between harvests. But they tended to squeeze Hindu and Jain banking families with their demands and terms. Now, think about it. If you were a banker and your ruler started to squeeze you, what might you consider? Well, these banking and merchant families started to do a few things in the 1700s. One, they slowly started to withdraw their support for regional kingdoms. And two, there was the possibility that they might throw in their lot with an external power who, to them, seemingly offered better agreements in terms of security and profitability. This is where the British would come in later. Now, we've covered quite a lot, so let's recap what we've examined in this lecture and try to make broader sense of it and what this means for the emergence of British colonial rule. First, we reviewed the regionalization of the Mughal Empire throughout the 1700s and how the Mughal Empire's rule was decentralized into regional kingdoms, mainly Mysore, Awadh, and Bengal. All of these kingdoms have been building up their state systems and, importantly, their revenue capabilities. Second, we proceeded to look at how Indians fit within the broader global economy in the early 1700s. We saw that it was a major part of the global economy and that it was an economy which exported finished textiles all over the world. We also looked at the advantages and disadvantages the British had in Indian trade. Thirdly, we analyzed the great merchant and banking families of North India. We saw how they supported regional Indian kingdoms through credit, commerce, and supplies, and that they had become prominent players in the regional politics and the courts of these kingdoms. Given all these facts, what were the prospects for colonial rule at this point? How did they look? Good? Bad? Inevitable? It's a hard question to answer. In hindsight, the prospects for colonial rule looked good, but they certainly were not inevitable. The broader dynamics of 18th century India opened up a possibility that any Indian regional power could rise to become the dominant power in the subcontinent. And this is where the English ended up, in the right place at the right time. It seemed impossible in 1750 that this private company from overseas would end up masters of the Indian subcontinent by 1820. But this is exactly what happened. The company would take advantage of the very dynamics and trends we discussed, and it would exploit them more ruthlessly than any other Indian kingdom. The result was that the company would end up channeling these economic forces on British, not Indian terms. And as an outside power, it could play one Indian power off another. Rather than replicating Caesar's conquest of Gaul for Rome, the British would not pull off a veni vidi vici, or I came, I saw, I conquered. Rather, they would take advantage of processes that had already been transpiring in India from the early 1700s.